If you want to turn to Mark, let's see, Mark 6 or Matthew 14 or Luke 9 or John 6. Take your pick. This is one of the rare occasions when you got 4 different options instead of just 2 or 3 or even just 1. The reason is because other than the resurrection of Jesus, this is the only miracle covered in all 4 gospel accounts. In fact, this is the only portion of Jesus' ministry prior to his last visit to Jerusalem, when he would, his last week or so, that's recorded by all 4. Not just the only miracle, but the only instance prior to that last visit to Jerusalem that's recorded by all 4, and the only part of this Galilean ministry that is referred to by John. So that makes it a little bit unique. As we've pointed out before, John usually made a habit of mentioning only the things that the others didn't mention, and he rarely mentioned the things that they did mention. But in this instance, he did mention it, this miracle here. John chose only 7 miracles to cover, and this is one of the ones that he did, and it's the only one that he mentioned that the others also mentioned. Some people call this a creative miracle, and we'll maybe see more on that in just a second. But just to give us a little bit of context to what we're dealing with here, this was the end of Jesus' 3rd Galilean tour, and Herod Antipas had beheaded John the Baptist. That's what we looked at Wednesday night in our Bible study. And now Herod is interested in Jesus' work, and he wants to know what all this is about. He was a little bit afraid based on some superstitions that weren't really grounded in reality. He thought it was John the Baptizer raised from the dead. Of course, Jesus was not John the Baptizer raised from the dead. Jesus was somebody that Herod should really fear even more than if John the Baptizer had been raised from the dead. But now the apostles had come back from their limited mission, their limited commission, and all these circumstances and everything that led up to this led to Jesus deciding that he needed to withdraw from Capernaum. He's going to leave Capernaum, and he's going to go on the other side of the lake, the Sea of Galilee, to Bethsaida. That's also been called Julius, or Bethsaida Julius. And he probably did this partly for the sake of his disciples. They needed rest. Every time they tried to get it, they couldn't because people followed them. And spoiler alert, it's about to happen again, even though he was trying to withdraw. Maybe it was for the sake of the people, because in the event of John's execution, they may have been tempted to start an uprising of some kind. And it was probably also partly for himself and his followers to get out of the territory of Herod Antipas, because though it's not on this map, Galilee belonged to Herod Antipas, and then if you can see this little pink part, I guess, that is the very northern tip of the other part that Antipas had jurisdiction over. But he did not have jurisdiction over any of this, and so Jesus and his apostles are now going to go over here across the river there to Bethsaida for some rest, or that's what they had hoped. They actually went by boat there, even though they could have gone more quickly on foot. But maybe that was hopefully to elude or evade some people that were going to be following. Didn't work, but it was worth a shot at least. It's just a few hours sail from Capernaum. And what happens next is truly amazing. And that's what we're going to cover in our lesson here today, this morning. We'll start by reading John's account in John 6. We're going to read verses 2 through 14. In fact, I'll just start at verse 1. it says, "After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, 'Where are we to buy bread, so that these people may eat?' He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?' Jesus said, 'Have the people sit down.' Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill," lost my place here. "He told his disciples, 'Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost.' So they gathered them up and filled the 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, 'This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world.'" Okay, there's John's account. Now very quickly we'll skip over to Mark's account in Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 30. It says this, "The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, 'Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while.' For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And when they went away in the boat to a desolate place, by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat.' But he answered them, 'You give them something to eat.' And they said to him, 'Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?' And he said to them, 'How many loaves do you have? Go and see.' And when they had found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men." Okay. This is what we would call a miracle, yes. Quite an impressive miracle. Probably why John went ahead and mentioned it, even though the other 3 already had. And there are plenty of things that we can learn from this whole situation of this account of this miracle. Not just being impressed by the miracle itself. But as we put these 2 accounts together, and we could put the other 2 in with them, we get a fuller picture here how a few people, and I guess a few relatively speaking, actually reached Bethsaida before the apostles and Jesus did. Somehow they knew where they were going. How'd they find out? I don't know. But they did, because they were there. So beating them there, Jesus already sees a decent crowd of people as he approaches the shore. But then we learn from John's account that a much greater number, the majority, showed up later as he was already sitting and teaching. And the reason it's been suggested there were so many people was maybe in part because of the Passover. John says the Passover was at hand, and there would have been many people probably beginning their journey up there that were from that northern part, beginning their journey, maybe going around the lake, like the people that went on foot went around the top of the lake there to begin their journey south. And that may be partially why there were this many people, the number of which we'll see in just a second. We've already read it, but we'll look a little bit closer at that. But what we're going to focus on here in this lesson is how Jesus helped people. Why He helped them, how He helped them, and then what we can take from that. How can we apply that to ourselves? How can we help people? Because we also need to notice and not forget that we too have a responsibility to help people. Help others. And Jesus gave us the perfect example. We have passages like Galatians 6:10 where Paul said, "So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of the faith." Do we have a responsibility to help people? Sounds like it, but there's more. James 1:27, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world." Visiting orphans and widows, the word visit there, that verb has been discussed many times. It doesn't just mean the way that we think of visiting, but actually to care for them, to give them some sort of aid or assistance in their affliction. And that can be done in a number of ways. Obviously, there's only one way to literally visit somebody, the way we use that, or maybe a few different ways, phone call, in person, etc. But what that verb actually means is to care for them, and that can be done in all kinds of different ways. And 1 John 3:17, "If anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him?" Very powerful rhetorical question there. Anyone has the world's goods. Now that does not mean you have all the goods in the world. But what are the world's goods? What do you think? What might the world's goods be? Okay. Things of the world that we have to have. Necessities of life. The world's goods. Food, clothing, shelter, etc. All these physical, earthly things. Not necessarily worldly things, the way we use that word, but earthly things. Anybody in here have some of those? Pretty sure we all do, to an extent. And therefore, if anyone has those things, and then sees his brother in need, and then closes his heart against him, in other words, doesn't do anything, how can that person say that God's love is in him? So, we have a responsibility to help other people, and Jesus, like we said, gives us a wonderful example of that. So Jesus shows up. He arrives on the shore. And he sees a crowd of people. Now, put yourself in his shoes, okay? And his sandals. Think again about what Mark's account says. The apostles returned, told him what they had done and taught. And he said, "All right, let's go away by ourselves to a desolate place so we can rest a little while." For they were coming, there were many were coming and going, and they didn't even have leisure to eat. Okay, so he says, let's go away to a desolate place for a little while and rest. They get in the boat, they go away, they get to the shore, crowd of people there. How would you react? Most of us, I'll say most, I don't want to drag all of you down to my low level, but most of us probably would be at least a little bit annoyed. And some of us might be extremely annoyed. Some of us might be angry. And some of us might give a sigh of annoyance, here we go again. These people, I don't even know why I came. I wish I'd never left heaven. That's what most of us would be thinking at this point. Because let's face it, even in addition to just the general annoyance and aggravation that he might feel, when you lack sleep and food and rest, it does things to you. Mentally, even the most healthy person, lack of sleep can mess you up. In extremes anyway. Different people can operate on different levels of sleep, but when you are truly deprived of sleep and rest, it can really mess you up. So, Jesus, what we see Him doing, not any of that. He doesn't show any sign of annoyance. He doesn't sigh. He doesn't feel like He wants to wring their necks and tell them to get a life. Don't you have better things to do? Follow me around everywhere? But what does it say about how He reacted? What was His reaction? He had compassion on them. What an example. He had compassion. He sees them, and His mind, this is maybe the most important thing of all in this connection or on this point. His mind didn't go to Himself at all. You see, being aggravated or annoyed, that's a self-reflective thing, isn't it? You're aggravated for your own sake. I deserve to have some rest. And did he deserve to have some rest? Of course he did. Did he deserve to be swamped like and thronged like this all the time? No. Should the people have maybe also been a little less selfish and considered him? Yeah. And yet none of that crosses Jesus' mind. And we can be sure that if His disciples tried to do that in His defense, he would have probably rebuked them or said, hey, it's not about me, it's about them. So,
the disciples did kind of react like most of us would have. Send them away. Tell them to go
yeah.
Tell them to take care of themselves.
Yeah, they may not have said anything yet, but later on, it's getting dark and evening has come. Now, what time did they get there? We don't know, but when evening had come, gives the impression that quite a bit of time passed by. And there, the patience is running thin. But that He was always teaching them by example, whether He was doing it on purpose or whether He was just being Himself, and it ended up being an example or teaching by example. Everybody else is more important. People first. These people, I'm going to consider them before I consider myself. And that would be a powerful example. And we see little snapshots throughout Jesus' ministry where the apostles and disciples are getting a little, frazzled and patience running low. And Jesus is always on point. And He's always there to make the correction gently, correcting them, and not so gently if necessary. But He sees them, He sees a great crowd, and He had compassion on them. Last thing we might expect. Because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Here again we see. So what did He do for them? Seeing them as sheep without a shepherd. He began to teach them. Now that's what Jesus was doing when He was there. Now what our main focus is in our lesson here doesn't happen until later. What He spent the day doing with them was teaching them. And then it says it grew late. So He was teaching them. However long they had been there, that's what Jesus had been doing the whole time, teaching them. Not a word of a miracle yet. No healing. I can't help but imagine that if Jesus had done some healing on that occasion, then it would have been... Actually, I'll take that back. Matthew does mention it, that He did heal a few. It seems a few. He had compassion on them and healed them. And whether He taught them and people were being brought to Him as He was teaching, or if He healed them and then taught them, it seems that what He did most of that day was taught them. And then it grows late, and the disciples said, okay, this has gone on long enough. It's getting late. Tell them to leave. They can go into the neighboring villages and get some food and grab a bite to eat, get some supper. Been sitting here all day. We're all hungry. Probably didn't plan on being in this desolate place this long. Send them away so they can go eat. And we kind of had to put the different accounts together here to get the full picture. But in Mark's account at least, he says, well, why don't you give them something to eat? Now, if you notice what John's account said, if you notice when we read that in John chapter 6, he said, it's worded a little bit differently, and he said, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? But then what does it say? He said that to test Philip. He said this to Philip. Why Philip? I don't know. But for some reason he said it to Philip to test him. Now I can't help but think that he probably, the same thing applied in Mark 6:37. He said, why don't you give them something to eat? Well, that's a strange thing to tell a group of men who don't have any food, isn't it? You give them something to eat. But they explained, 200 denarii worth of bread wouldn't be enough, even for them, this is what Philip said, to even have a little bit to eat. If we spent 200 denarii worth of bread, that's 200 days worth of labor, of wages, I guess, based on the footnote of what a denarius is. So he says, or they say, we could spend 200 denarii worth of bread, and it still would not be enough for them to just get a little bit to eat. But then, Andrew, haven't heard much about Andrew lately, or at all, since he was first called, since he first started following Jesus and went and found his brother. He stands up and he says, or he says at least, well, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many? Kind of a ... we're all still sitting here stumped. We don't really know. But it's still interesting that he said that, isn't it? Why would he bring that up? If indeed, as he said, what are 5 little loaves, and we're not talking about, loaves of bread that you'd buy at the grocery that we know of, but very little things, more like crackers, to what it would look like to us. He said, what are they for so many? Well, what's the answer to that? What are they for so many? Nothing. Nothing at all. It's a little something, but for so many, nothing. How much would you have to divide that for 5,000 plus to get a bite? How small would your bite be? It wouldn't even be a bite. It would be so small, it might as well just be a whiff. You get a whiff of it and hope that gives you some sort of sustenance. Well, he still said it though. He still brought up this boy, this young boy. And in Matthew's account, it's presented a little bit differently. Jesus says, in response to their suggestion to send them away, he said, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. And they said, well, we don't have anything but 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's all we have. And Jesus said, okay, bring that to me then. Bring me that little boy's lunch. I stole the little boy's lunch. Or, more likely, he brought them his lunch or the food that he had. Why did he have it? For whatever reason he had it. He had it, and he brought it to them. There probably was a little bit of time, whichever the accounts, he said, go and see. That would have meant they're going to go around at least a little bit and, does anybody have any food here? Because their master told them to go and see. And they probably didn't go and see among the 12 of them because that wouldn't have taken much time. They probably already would have known. Anyway, we don't have anything. We didn't bring anything. We don't have anything. But in total, they had these 5 loaves, 2 fish, and that they got from this boy. And Jesus says, bring those, give it to me. And he told everybody to sit down, or he told the disciples, get everybody to sit down. Mark mentions in groups. Maybe each apostle was going to have his own little group that he was going to be serving or whatever. Sat down in groups, And it says, what did he do first? Okay, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He looked up to heaven, and Mark says he said a blessing. Now, we use that sometimes, don't we? You want to say the blessing. I'm convinced that many people may not even understand what that means, to say a blessing. That I think we generally understand what it means, that when somebody says, do you want to say the blessing? And they say yes, be glad to, what do they then proceed to do? They say a prayer. So we understand that say a blessing and say a prayer are really the same thing. I think it's helpful that when these parallel accounts, John doesn't say that he said a blessing over it. What does John say Jesus did when he took the loaves and the fish? Let's see, it's in John 6, verse... He gave thanks. Okay, so he took the food and he gave thanks. So, to say a blessing is not some magical formula where Jesus used some sort of divine power and he somehow blessed the food that was in front of them. And some people may have that idea that to bless it, even in regard to the Lord's Supper. Blessing it, he didn't do something to the food. He thanked God for that food. That's what it means to say a blessing over the food, is to give thanks for the food. Okay? Put John and Mark's accounts together, not to mention the other two. And that's the conclusion. We learn that from a parallel glance at those two accounts. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. They were in groups of 50s, hundreds and 50s. And he divided 2 fish among them all, and the loaves. How did he do that? What would that look like? There are different ways that you could see that being carried out. Did he just, here he's got a plate with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he gets a plate or something, a napkin, puts some in there, enough for one person, hands it. And then he does it again. Here's some for one person, hands it. But then it's not going anywhere. It's still 5 loaves and 2 fish every time. To the point where everybody has some. This would have taken a long time. It's getting late already. Unless he also performed some sort of miracle to disperse it, which it does not seem to suggest at all. Everybody ate. And remember what Philip said, 200 denarii worth of bread wouldn't be enough for anybody, even for everybody to have just a little bit. Well, these 5 loaves and 2 fish were enough for everybody to eat and be satisfied. And they had leftovers. And not just a little bit of leftovers. They started with 1 basket of 5 loaves and 2 fish, and they ended with 12 baskets full of loaves and fish. That's a pretty neat ordeal, I would say. You ever had more leftovers than what you started with? Probably not. Even if you felt like there was this one time that I'm pretty sure there were more leftovers than what we started. No, it didn't. That's impossible. But not with Jesus. He did it. He made this be enough for this whole group of people. Now, here's a question. How many people were there? Well, we're not told how many people there were. We're just told how many men there were. And this is one of those times where the word men is not that generic word where we get anthropology, anthropos. That word means people, humans, human beings. This is not that word. This is a word that means men. Okay? So if there were 5,000 men, how many total were there? Well, I highly doubt that every one of these men had a woman with him. We don't know how many would have. Maybe half. I don't know if that would be a conservative estimate. Well, there, even with my terrible math skills, well, that would be 7,500. And let's say half of them had a child with them. That's as far as my math's going to go. I don't know. So, I mean, what, 10,000 maybe estimated total? Or maybe that's too much. Maybe there were only just a few more than 5,000. I don't care if there were 500. This is incredible. It's incredible because it's impossible, and yet Jesus did it. He created almost just like he did at the wedding feast, okay? They ran out of grape juice, wine as it's called in the Scripture. He told them to fill those jars up with water, and yet when it was served, it wasn't water. So he created grape juice from grapes that never existed, that had never been squeezed, never been grown on a vine, literally never existed. He created the juice from grapes that never existed. Well, here he created food that never existed. It really had nothing to do with the 5 loaves and 2 fish, did it? That just happens to be the selection for that occasion. If the boy had had 2 cheeseburgers and 4 orders of fries, that's what they would have had. Then they really would have been amazed because they've never had that before. But still, they were amazed. And why did Jesus do this? For popularity? So people would have a story to take home with them? They needed it. They were hungry. And they were not in a situation or a place or a circumstance where it was going to be easy for them to get food. And Jesus, why did he do this? He wanted to. That's the simplest answer I could think of. He wanted to do this because of the same reason that he taught them many things. He began to teach them many things because he had compassion on them. Now he has compassion on them again. And so he sees to their other needs in feeding them. So he feeds them spiritually first. We should not miss that. Now he's going to feed them physically. And later on, he's going to have to point it out more bluntly why that is much more important than physical. The heavenly food is much more important. So, there are people that need help. We all agree, I'm sure. Sure, there are people who don't need help, genuinely, and take advantage. But we can't use them as the benchmark for everybody. We shouldn't ignore that, and we should keep that in mind. But there are also people who really should not be helped. Yes, sir.
It's easy for any of us to want to look to others that have more means than we do to do those things. But the responsibility for each of us in that final day is how we have used whatever amount or blessings of things that we have had. In other words, we need to concentrate on what we have. He concentrates here on the loaves and fish that they have.
Mm-hmm.
Not on what they don't have.
Yeah.
And we need to be more responsible just on whatever little we have, that we're using it for his cause along with sustaining ourselves.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, that the apostles were focused on what they didn't have. Now, of course, this is the lesson to be learned, one of the lessons to be learned, even though it was shown in an impossible way, but they still used this tiny little bit that they had to do this great deed. And it would be no different than if that young boy, that young man, whoever, whatever he was, he still gave it up. even if it was just to share with one other person or to give to another person, totally give it away. He still denied himself and gave that up. But as a whole, they used this little that they had. Even though Philip's rhetorical question was, or Andrew rather, was very valid, what is so little for so many people? Well, Jesus showed them how big a little bit can do. How much just a little bit can do. And that's perfectly in harmony with other passages in the New Testament that talk about doing things according to what we have, according to our opportunity, and so on and so forth. So, what did the apostles do? Well, they started to make excuses. We're good at that. People are good at making excuses. I think there are probably few things that people are generally more talented at than making excuses. We all have all sorts of different abilities and talents and skill sets and personalities, but one thing that we're all really good at is making excuses and creating excuses. We come up with excuses. We're also really good at convincing ourselves that those excuses are valid immediately. We automatically take them to be legitimate before we even evaluate it or assess the situation. So what were their excuses? Well, we've already looked at this one. We don't have the resources. But Jesus challenged that, and he would ultimately teach them they need to learn to rely on God and His resources and not get discouraged based on their own lack of resources. Go and see what you do have. That takes thought and time and energy, all for the purpose of how can I help these people? Go and see. Before you conclude, go and see. And that's a good example for us today as well. It's not our problem. Maybe another excuse. These people are not our people, children. Why should I have to worry about giving them food? I didn't birth these people. So, what is their hunger? Or, we didn't invite them here. Tell them to go get their own food. Are they going to give us food? None of that worked. None of those excuses, none of that reasoning was going to stand with Jesus. They don't deserve it. Also didn't work. The excuses didn't matter, and they still don't matter. Jesus didn't listen to them then, and He doesn't listen to them today when we try to make them. He told them to help, and He tells us the same thing. So how can we help? How can we help? Well, here's a few things with the rest of our brief time. Follow Jesus' spirit of helping others. One way that we can help, we might call that a first step. It doesn't necessarily help anybody, but that's the start. We follow His same spirit. And that goes back to the beginning where we talked about how He showed up there on the shore and He had compassion on them. He didn't pity Himself. He had compassion for them and He wanted to help them. So first of all, He helped them spiritually, taught them, He healed some of their sick, and then He wasn't going to be done after that, even though He'd already done so much for them. Never was there a, haven't I helped you enough kind of attitude with Jesus. It's not to say that He was totally unlimited and He handed out unconditional help of all sorts and all kinds all the time, but considered what was needed and His compassion for the people, He helped very liberally. We can focus on what we have. Talked about that. Getting ahead of myself here. Focus on what we have, not on what we don't have. We already covered that part. Rely on God's resources. God can help providentially. He's not going to help miraculously. If I have, one plate of food and I want to help this whole group of people, God's not going to make that one plate of food spread out the way He did here. But there are less direct ways and non-miraculous ways that God can help. everything we have, after all, is God has given us, hasn't He? There's not a single thing you have, at least that you have been blessed with, that did not come from God. And so you can't give somebody something that God didn't give you. So every time you give somebody anything, you're using God's resources. But there are other resources that God has that we might underestimate, like His providence and things like that. And just how much a little bit of good can do. Just like James said, one little spark can set a whole forest on fire, and he's talking about how dangerous the tongue is. Well, that could also be applied to good. Just a little tiny spark of good can kindle a whole forest fire of good and blessing in a good way. Let's see. Do what the Lord says even if we don't understand. Very good advice in all areas of life. I don't really understand. I think baptism would fall into that category. What in the world does being dunked underwater have to do with my sins? Nothing, other than the fact that God said to do it. So even if I don't fully understand, I can still and should still do what the Lord says. Just like they didn't understand 5 loaves and 2 fish. None of this is making any sense, Lord. Well, it didn't need to make sense. They just needed to do it. And it made sense afterwards. Stop legitimizing our excuses. Those of our own and those of our brethren. I shouldn't let mistakes fly in my own life, but I should also do what I can to help my brothers and sisters not be deceived by their own excuses. So, and of course, there is a right and a wrong way to do that. It's not something that we should take lightly, but we should find a way to gently and thoughtfully and compassionately help our brothers and sisters when they are obviously being convinced by their own excuses